after the incident with the neighbor where she tried to escape and get help, and Dee Dee just continued to lie and say false things about Gypsy, Gypsy began using the internet after Dee Dee went to bed and met men in online chat rooms. And though her mother chained her to the bed and threatened to smash her fingers with a hammer when she found out, Gypsy continued to chat with men, hoping that one of them can save her. Hey babes, welcome back to the What Like It's Hard podcast, which is a legal podcast for women. I'm your host Jasmine, and you already know what time it is. Grab your Starbucks, it's fall season, grab a PSL, pumpkin spice latte, and let's get into today's episode. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button so every Tuesday you'll be alerted when I have a new episode. Today I'm going to chat with you about the case of Gypsy Rose Blanchard. This case is super intense and super detailed, so I will break it down into 5 sections. The first one's going to be Dee Dee and Gypsy's background and life. Second, psychological issues / abuse. Third, the crime scene and evidence. 4, the arrests and charges. And finally 5, the lawsuit outcomes and Gypsy today. I will begin in July of 1991. That was when Dee Dee Blanchard and Rod Blanchard had Gypsy. The couple ended up separating because Rod admitted to marrying for the wrong reasons. So Gypsy's parents were separated super early on in her age, which led Dee Dee to be the primary caregiver of Gypsy. So the madness began when Gypsy was only 3 months old. That's when Dee Dee was convinced that she had sleep apnea. Dee Dee took her to hospitals and had her hooked up to sleeping monitors, and she was just convinced that there was something wrong with her. But after all of those tests were run, there were no symptoms found to support that illness. Ever since then, Dee Dee thereafter was convinced Gypsy had a number of health issues, blamed it on her premature birth and an unknown chromosome disorder. The health issues were pretty serious. Among them included leukemia, asthma, vision and hearing impairment, muscular dystrophy, and seizures. Dee Dee was convinced Gypsy had all these things, obviously brainwashed her daughter into thinking she had them as well, confined Gypsy to a wheelchair, saying that she can't walk because of her muscular dystrophy, seizures, cancer, all these allegations that aren't even true. Dee Dee was convinced that Gypsy's illnesses were so bad she had to take her out of school in the 2nd grade. So basically, Gypsy had a 2nd grade education. Dee Dee claimed to be homeschooling her, but in actuality, she obviously had mental issues, so I don't know how serious her homeschooling was. But eventually, Gypsy taught herself to read through the Harry Potter series, which those Harry Potter books are pretty hefty, so that's super impressive for a young woman. Due to all these illnesses that she told her daughter that she had, Gypsy was subject to so much abuse in taking excessive, unnecessary medications, having unnecessary surgeries. She was implanted with an unnecessary feeding tube. Her head was constantly shaved. Her mother said that due to her medications, her hair would fall off, so it would just be easier if she shaved her head regularly. Some medications have side effects. So one of the medications she took for, I think it was an anti-seizure medication, caused her teeth to decay. Her teeth were rotted so bad that they were surgically removed. On top of that, her mom had her saliva glands surgically removed to control quote-unquote drooling. But we later find out that the drooling was pretty much due to her. Dee Dee would rub, a numbing cream in her gums before the visits to the doctor to say her drooling was uncontrollable. It was just insanity and neglect, abuse in every way. This poor girl endured so many unnecessary pains, to undergo surgeries, to have her head shaved, to be controlled by her mother in these ways is just insane. On top of that, Dee Dee lied to Gypsy about her age. So just imagine growing up being lied to, being manipulated, being brainwashed, being abused by your own mother. Let's go to Hurricane Katrina time. So in Hurricane Katrina, that hurricane was very severe. A lot of homes got destroyed. It was easy for Dee Dee to use that as an excuse to why Gypsy's medical records and birth certificate were destroyed. That's another way she just dug herself in this lie of, oh, well, Gypsy's real birth date was 1995. She convinced Gypsy she was born in 1995, but she was really born in 1991. So she was lied to about her age for the majority of her life. In 2008, Habitat for Humanity built them a small home with wheelchair access and all the things they needed to live. That was a time for them, once again, I don't want to say them, but for her mom to take advantage of Gypsy's disabilities. She also had Gypsy do Make-A-Wish foundations, go to concerts, you know, all the you know, things that people who are ill and sick and don't have that much longer to live get to experience because of their illnesses. But Gypsy had none of those, and for her mom to take advantage of the system like that was just undeniably wrong. Due to Gypsy's medical conditions, of course, Dee Dee took Gypsy to a number of doctors and a number of hospitals. One pediatric neurologist specifically named Bernardo Fasterstein, he actually suspected that Dee Dee had Munchausen by proxy because he told Dee Dee there were no abnormalities shown from all the tests performed, but she was still convinced. And as soon as he confronted Dee Dee about her Munchausen by proxy, Dee Dee stopped seeing him because, you know, she knew what she was doing was wrong, and she didn't want Gypsy to be subjected to somebody saying the truth and actually saying there's something wrong with Dee Dee. She had a mental disorder, which is Munchausen by proxy. We'll get more into that shortly. So, long story short, Gypsy Rose Blanchard grew up her whole life in a wheelchair, controlled by her mother, fed through feeding tubes. Her head was shaved constantly, constant surgeries, excessive unnecessary medication. She was just subjected to a number of abusive actions by her mom. And also, when they were anywhere in public, Dee Dee would hold Gypsy's arm, and if Gypsy said one thing her mom didn't like, she would squeeze her arm so she would stop talking. That's abuse in itself, and controlling and manipulation. Okay, so I gave you a little background about Dee Dee and Gypsy. So let's get to the psychological issues and abuse that this case endured. So the first thing I want to mention is Munchausen by proxy, which is pretty much the number one cause of this whole situation. And what Munchausen by proxy is it's a psychological disorder, and it's marked by attention-seeking behavior by a caregiver through those who are in their care. It's a relatively rare disorder, and it affects a primary caretaker, often the mother. The person with this disorder gains attention by seeking medical help for exaggerated or made-up symptoms of a child in their care. As healthcare providers strive to identify what's causing the child's symptoms, the deliberate actions of the parent or caretaker can often make the symptoms worse. So Munchausen disorder is somebody who is convincing themselves that they are ill and they seek medical attention for themselves. But Munchausen by proxy is a caregiver or someone else who's taking care of somebody, and they're convincing that person that they are ill. it's a psychological disorder, so it's kind of a disorder that, hey, look at me, like bringing attention to that person. And you see a lot of those symptoms in Dee Dee. She used Gypsy's quote-unquote illnesses to bring attention to herself with Habitat for Humanity, Make-A-Wish Foundation, just all of those things that she brought so much attention to herself. Not only the Munchausen by proxy, which is a psychological issue in this case, but also there was physical abuse. Like I said, Dee Dee would hold Gypsy's hand and squeeze it super hard in order to stop her from talking. That's physical abuse by squeezing her hand, and that's mental and manipulation abuse by telling her to stop talking. The more I researched this case, I wanted to pinpoint exactly when did Gypsy realize she wasn't ill. And I researched this for a while. Some articles claimed she found out in her teens. That was the main trend of what I was researching. But I watched several interviews as well, directly from Gypsy talking. She said in her own words, she knew she wasn't sick her whole life. Like, she knew she can walk, she knew she could eat regular food. But of course, when you're a daughter and your mom is subjecting you to this psychological and physical abuse, what can you do? That's all you know, and that's your mom, that's your caregiver. You go along with it. And eventually Gypsy had enough as she got older, and she naturally wanted to become more free and more independent. She attempted several escapes. On her several escape attempts, Dee Dee would catch her and bring her home and abuse her for weeks. She would hit her with a wire coat hanger. She would tie her to the bed. She would starve her. Just excessive child neglect and child abuse. In 2010, Dee Dee told everyone that Gypsy was 14, but she was actually 19 years old. She obviously knew she wasn't sick. Naturally, when you're 19, or actually I would say when you're 18, 19, you just have a natural inclination to want to be independent. You're an adult, basically. So, although, like I said, Dee Dee told Gypsy and everyone she was 14, she was nearly in her 20s. She continued to try to escape from her mother because she just had enough. She was desperate. She was in a state of desperation. It was just getting excessive. So one night, Gypsy showed up to her neighbor's door. And mind you, when they moved to that Habitat for Humanity house, they had several neighbors who knew their story, obviously, and became close to Dee Dee and Gypsy. Gypsy became super close to one of her neighbors. She looked to her as a big sister. One night, Gypsy showed up to her neighbor's door, standing on her own 2 feet, begging for a ride to the hospital. Then Dee Dee found out. She quickly intervened and explained the whole thing away, a talent she had cultivated over the years. It basically explained that anytime Gypsy began to stray or become independent, or suggested that she was anything but a small innocent child suffering from a deadly illness, Dee Dee would step in and explain that Gypsy Rose's mind was addled by diseases and medication. After the incident with the neighbor where she tried to escape and get help, and Dee Dee just continued to lie and say false things about Gypsy, Gypsy began using the internet after Dee Dee went to bed and met men in online chat rooms. Though her mother chained her to the bed and threatened to smash her fingers with a hammer when she found out, Gypsy continued to chat with men, hoping that one of them can save her. This is an important part of the story. We go from the abuse to Gypsy is now almost 20 years old, even though Dee Dee is saying that she's only 14, and she wants to gain independence. She knew her whole life she could walk and, eat normally, and enough is enough. She would sneak in sodas in her room and drink Pepsis, even though her mom said she was allergic to sugar, some crazy things. But enough is enough, and she became desperate. So with the invention of the internet and online chat rooms, she used the internet to try to find somebody that can save her after Dee Dee went to bed. So after being on the internet for a little bit, in 2012, she met Nicholas Godijon, which he was 23 years old at the time, and he was from Wisconsin. A quick little background about Nick Godijon. He did have a criminal record for indecent exposure, and he did have a medical history of mental illness. And Gypsy knew that, but she didn't really pay that attention. Like, you have to keep in mind, she was super desperate, and she was in a desperate situation. From the manipulation and psychological abuse, she kind of convinced Nick to murder Dee Dee. After watching a few interviews and reading articles, she had that plan for a while. You know, it's not like she just woke up one day and said, hey, come over and let's carry out the murder. She just explained to Nick what was going on, and she didn't know what to do. And, you know, she just thought there was no way out except murder. Nick carried out the stabbing. She asked Nick to come over one night after Dee Dee got home from a doctor's appointment and she went to bed. Nick came into the house. Gypsy went into the bathroom and handed Nick the knife and murder weapon. Nick went into Dee Dee's room and stabbed her viciously a number of times. And Gypsy says she covered her ears in the bathroom, but she did hear her mom yell in a startle and call out for her. And Gypsy said she wanted to go help her, but she was too scared. That was just, you know, the night of the murder. And after watching, I did watch Gypsy's initial interrogation video, and she told the interrogation officer that after the stabbing occurred, Nick was super aggressive and abusive. She had a really humongous bruise on her arm. She said it was from Nick grabbing her by the arm and demanding she get on her hands and knees and clean up every drop of blood from the floor. After that, the couple took a Greyhound and went back to Nick's house. She didn't think she would get caught. She didn't think of the consequences. She just went. The craziest thing is a Facebook status. Gypsy had access to Dee Dee's Facebook account. She put a Facebook status, a very vulgar and explicit Facebook status. She said she put that status to have Dee Dee's body be found. She wanted the body to be found, and she wanted somebody to discover Dee Dee there. The Facebook status basically said that BITCH is dead. I stabbed that fat pig, basically, and, you know, raped her daughter. All these vulgar and explicit things just so it could bring attention to Dee Dee. The Blanchards' friends suspected something was not right. Phone calls were answered, and several of them went to the house. They saw Dee Dee's Nissan Cube in the driveway and realized, you know, they should be home. But no one answered the door, so they called 911. When the police arrived, they had to wait for a search warrant to be issued before they could enter. But they allowed one of the neighbors to be present to climb through a window, where he saw that the inside of the house was largely undisturbed and that all of Gypsy's wheelchairs were still present. By this time, the warrant was issued and police entered the house, and then they found Dee Dee's body. A GoFundMe account was set up to pay for her funeral expenses and possibly Gypsy's. Okay, let's pause for a second. Dee Dee's body was found, and the police and neighbors were concerned about Gypsy. They thought somebody killed Dee Dee and abducted Gypsy. She was disabled. She doesn't have her feeding tubes. She doesn't have her medication. She's not in a wheelchair. They suspected that Gypsy was somewhere deceased. All who knew the Blanchards fear the worst, even if Gypsy had not been harmed. They believed she would be helpless without her wheelchair, her medications, her support equipment like oxygen tanks and feeding tubes. However, a neighbor who was super close to her, like I said, she considered her a big sister, she confided in her, and she told police that she knew about Gypsy and her secret online boyfriend. She showed them the printouts she had saved, which included his name. And based on that information, police asked Facebook to trace the IP address from which the posts to Dee Dee's account had been made. It turned out to be in Wisconsin, which is where Nick lived. And the next day, police agencies in the county where the Godojans lived raided his home. Both him and Gypsy surrendered and were taken into custody on charges of murder and felony armed criminal action. So the news that Gypsy was safe and greeted with relief back in Springfield, where she and Godojan were soon extradited and held on a $1 million bond. But in announcing the news, the Greene County Sheriff, Jim Arnott, warned things are not always as they appear. The media in Springfield soon reported the truth of the Blanchards' lives, that Gypsy had never been sick and had always been able to walk. But her mother made her pretend otherwise, using physical abuse to control her. Sheriff urged people not to donate any money to the family until investigators learned the extent of the fraud. So the truth finally comes out. Gypsy and her boyfriend are caught. Dee Dee is murdered. This is intense. So let's talk about the crime scene and evidence. Okay, so the crime scene is obviously Gypsy's home. Upon entering the home, there was so much evidence. Obviously, Gypsy was locked in the bathroom, so her wheelchair was in there still, her not in it. There was drops of blood. You know, as much as Gypsy tried to clean it, obviously there's still going to be blood traces. You know, in her garbage in her room, they found a Pepsi bottle, an empty Pepsi bottle, so obviously she could drink sugar. Just so many clues that made everyone understand how fraudulent this was. Another key thing in this case is, why did Gypsy do it? She was increasingly desperate. Gypsy wanted to get out of the abuse from her mother, and she felt the only way out is to plot her murder. She tried to escape multiple times. All the abuse and all of the manipulation from her mother, she found no way out. Like I said, she was physically abusive. She was hitting her. She was starving her. It's just enough is enough. They got arrested in 2015, and they also raided Godojan's house, where they found the clothes he committed the crime in, which had traces of blood. They found his shoes, which had traces of blood. There was just so much evidence. And they did find the murder weapon, which was a knife that he's used to stab Gypsy's mom. And just everything was like breadcrumbs to lead them to Gypsy and Nick, especially the Facebook post. So let's get into the fourth topic, which is the arrests and charges. Gypsy ended up pleading guilty to second-degree murder, and she did get 10 years. So typically, second-degree murder is defined as a murder that is not premeditated, or a murder that is caused by the offender's reckless conduct that displays an obvious lack of concern for human life. And her sentencing was incredibly complicated because despite planning her mother's murder, she was actually the victim of abuse. So this is a controversial topic. Some people don't think she should have gotten any charges. They don't think she should have done 10 years. You know, and even in an interview, she admitted, like, she's not in the right place. She's not in the right place where she needs to be to get the help that she needs. But nonetheless, she's serving her 10 years. She'll be eligible for parole in 2024. And Nick Godojan, however, who actually committed the murder, he pleaded not guilty, and he got charged with first-degree murder and is serving a life sentence. First-degree murder is defined by federal and state laws, so it varies state by state, but generally it's defined as a killing which is deliberate and premeditated. Initially, the state prosecutors wanted to charge Gypsy with first-degree murder, which could carry the death penalty or life in prison in the state of Missouri. But like I said, due to the circumstances in Gypsy's case, where it became clear she was subjected to systemic abuse, the prosecution demanded it to be a second-degree murder. If somebody pleads not guilty, which is what Nick did, it's merely an assertion that the accusation made by the government are not true. It places upon the government the burden of proving guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. To prove the guilt, the prosecution must prove each of the essential elements of the offenses charged beyond a reasonable doubt. So obviously he was found guilty. And to plead guilty, which is what Gypsy did, is an admission that the charges are true. It relieves the government of proving guilt provided the parties can submit sufficient factual basis for the plea. In a nutshell, this case was intense, it was sad, and it just had so much publicity because who could even understand why a mother would do this? But like I said, Munchausen by proxy will cause somebody to do that, and that's a mental illness. All right, let's get to the last topic, which is the lawsuit outcomes and Gypsy today. Gypsy is actually thriving in prison, unlike other stories you hear where people lose weight in prison and they're just miserable and in their mind they don't want to be there. Gypsy, however, is thriving. She says she's more free than she's ever been in her own home. She gained weight. She's doing so well, and she earned a GED in prison. She's working in prison, and she's learning photography. She did do a Dr. Phil interview in 2017, and she admitted that she is not glad that her mother is dead, but she is glad to be out of that situation. So that's the overall outcome. She felt like she had no choice. She is super sad. Obviously, her mom was her best friend despite everything that happened. She was not actually supportive of The Act, which is the movie well, it's not a movie. It's a series that I tagged in my blog post, which is how I even came to know of this story. I watched The Act on Hulu. But when I researched it, due to legal reasons, Joey King, which is the star and played Gypsy in the series, had no contact with Gypsy due to legal reasons. She doesn't get any money from that series. She doesn't have anything to do with that. But I thought it was a good portrayal of her story. That's how I was even exposed to the case. So you guys, let me know what you think. Do you think she should have served 10 years? What do you think should have been the outcome? Me personally, I don't think she should have served time. I think she should have been sent to a rehab or mental institution that she can get the proper help she needs. She obviously has post-traumatic stress disorder from what happened. She was abused for so many years. She should be somewhere where she can get mental help and learn how to live independently and think for herself. And that's today's episode. Let me know what you think. Leave a review. Rate my show. I'm so happy to be here and talk to you guys about law. And next week I will be talking about Martha Stewart. I love Martha Stewart. I love her cooking show with Snoop Dogg. So I will chat about her lawsuit. Yeah, so that's today's episode. Have a good day. Love you guys.